Welcome to Innovation and Leadership. I'm Jess Larson. Excited to have my friend, co-host Human Shahidi back on for our Between Two Plugs mini-series. If you don't know who, an EV Passport, revolutionary company changing how real estate owners are involved with their EV charging and raised $250 million and just a great human being. Who, we've got a pretty great guest this week. I'm going to leave it over to you to do the introduction here.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm so excited to introduce Jay Carney to everyone. Jay is a legend, to say the least. Someone who has conquered both Washington and Silicon Valley. I mean, his background is so dynamic from his time as the longest standing press secretary in this century under President Obama to challenging the Silicon Valley titans from Amazon to his latest venture here at Airbnb. I'm so excited to welcome you. And in between, you've had a lot of commentary from CNN and beyond. So welcome to the show, Jay.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to do this. I feel like I know I've made it, or at least I've changed my career enough to land on an innovation and leadership podcast. So I think that's pretty cool. But I have learned a little bit about both over the last several years.
Amazing. So, Jay, let's start with, where you are, right, with Airbnb. Obviously, you spent quite a bit of time at Amazon, and you landed at an Airbnb, and it seems like it sent some sound waves around Silicon Valley and even Washington. What drew you to Airbnb?
Well, it's almost a cliche, but I wasn't looking. This was a few years ago, but I did get, as somebody I respected a lot, who was a mutual friend, asked if I would be willing to speak with Brian Chesky, the CEO and co-founder of Airbnb. And I said, sure, if you think I should, why not? I'll do that. And we started talking, this was in February of 2022, and just on Zoom. And I'm on the East Coast. And it was right around, we hit it off. And then it was right around the time that Russia invaded Ukraine. And like with barely a turnaround, Airbnb was announcing that it would house 100,000 Ukrainian refugees because of that invasion. And I was just impressed by the speed of decision making, the ambition of it, the size of it, and also the values that it represented. So that said a lot to me about the company, about Brian, his co-founders. But it wasn't alone a reason to go. After a while, I also noticed something in my conversations with Brian that I wouldn't have understood 10 years earlier. When I went to Amazon after leaving the Obama White House, I spent a lot of time in the Valley and in tech space. I was interested in it. That's what I wanted to do. I didn't want to be a talking head forever. That's what former press secretaries tend to do. I wanted to try something new. I wanted to go into the tech space and the business space. And I went with Amazon. I met with Jeff Bezos and other leaders there, and it just felt the fit was great and it was really compelling. When it happened, somebody in that world said, "Oh, you're so smart to go work for a founder." Now I nodded and said, "Yeah, of course," but I didn't really understand what that meant. After working with Jeff, after understanding what it meant to work with somebody who actually gave birth to this idea and then built it from nothing into something incredible, and then getting to work with him when he still had all of it in his head, the whole history, everything about it, the good and the bad, and and just that passion that I think founders bring to their creations, if they still love them and care about them. And then when I started talking to Brian, I was like, oh yeah, I remember this feeling, this energy, right? And Brian has it. I mean, it's just, he's obviously, Airbnb is not a new company, but it's relatively new. It's certainly newer than some of the bigger names in tech. But it is what he lives and breathes every day. It's what he knows more about than anybody else. It's what he cares more about than anybody else. And it's just, it creates a lot of enthusiasm and energy around his vision. So that kind of got me thinking. And like I said, I just decided I'm at an age where it's like, well, what the hell, right? Why not? Let's try something to mix it up. I've been at Amazon for over 7 years, and that was an amazing experience. But I felt that sort of energy and innovative spirit and decided to make the leap. And it's been a little over 2 years now.
That's amazing. So let's kind of dive into that energy, that vision, that passion, that sort of X factor that you talk about that you felt during your time at Amazon and obviously at Airbnb with Brian. And I think, when I look at some of the leaders that, you have been part of their organizations, they all possess, to me, a variable that is unique across the board, right? President Obama, Jeff Bezos, Brian Chesky, right? Which is this notion of innovation diplomacy. Tell us about what's the common variable about those, that draw you in.
I think there's an inherent optimism that drives them. They really believe deep in their bones. They don't believe it, they know it, that the future will be better than the past and certainly and even better than the present. And that's possible because, we as a society and we as a country will innovate, create things, tools, ideas that will make it better. And it's not a straight line. President Obama always explained that to us when we were having rough times. But eventually, it heads in the right direction, in the direction of the new and the seemingly impossible becoming impossible. So I think that's something that I experienced with all three of those leaders that you mentioned. I also think the ability to take the long view. When I first started working for Jeff Bezos, people would ask me, how are they similar and how are they different? I was like, well, they're pretty different, right? I mean, in obvious ways, right? One's Barack Hussein Obama grew up in Hawaii. His father was Kenyan, his mother was from Kansas. And there's Jeff Bezos, who grew up mostly in Florida, but also in Texas. And had the different background, and yet they both had this ability to focus on like the longer goals and to stay focused on that and not get disrupted by them. That I think is pretty unique. It's certainly unique in business, and it's absolutely unique in politics, right? It's like we would go to the president, I and other advisors, and be like, especially ones who are dealing with the media and the sort of politics, and be like, sir, you got to say this, you got to do this, because we're getting the crap beat out of us on this subject, and we got to punch back. And he'd listen. He said, I appreciate the advice, but no, and it's not like he was right every time, but it fit in our view, but it fit who he was. And he honestly believed that to keep your eye in the distance and not get distracted by all of the fights. I mean, he knew how to do politics, obviously still does. We see him out today, but he was really animated by that long view and by the idea that the race is never over. And so you shouldn't spend all your energy today or this week. And Jeff was like that too. He famously was criticized in early days at Amazon for, where are the profits? Quarter after quarter after quarter. Why, investors are getting antsy. And this was before my time. I like to say when I got there, we started making real money. But he had this vision, and he had this vision about scaling and growth and plowing revenue back into the business and into innovation and creation. And that in the long run, it would pay out and benefit the company and shareholders and customers. So I think he was right. And I see that in Brian too. He's incredibly creative. What I love about Brian is he's highly unique within the tech community among most people in tech in general, but tech founders to be sure, which is he's a design student. He went to the Rhode Island School of Design. He's not a technologist. He's not a computer scientist or engineer. You need those people for sure. But he is most comfortable creating and designing and imagining things. And, that's also something very exciting about working at Airbnb. It's a very design driven company, and he's, surrounded us in leadership with people who are sort of design and innovation first, and other things after that. So it's very exciting.
That's so fascinating, and I think one of the things that caught me, when I found out we were chatting with you and looking at your background is, every single one of those folks you just mentioned has this obsession with, defining customer success, or I guess in President Obama's case it's really, community success or constituency success, right? And delivering value. And to me, I always view the world sort of in this triangle, which is how do we create value, and then there's your strategic integrity, and there's risk, right? And those three people, you talk about how they're obsessed with their core competencies and making sure that at the center of that is delivering customer or constituency success. Tell me how that's evolved, from, the time that you were, press secretary to your time even at Amazon, and how it's shifted to what you're doing here at Airbnb.
Sure. Now, before going into the Obama White House, I had been a journalist for many years, and it was serendipitous. It wasn't a plan. It just happened. I had a very close friend who was involved in that campaign in '08 as an advisor to then Senator Biden, and then Vice President Biden, and that's how I kind of stumbled into this. But I had been pretty cynical. As a journalist, it's almost a requirement of the job, especially if you're Washington-based, and you tended to see politics in that profession as a zero-sum game. It's a horse race. Somebody wins, somebody loses, no matter how small the issue. And what I was struck by with both President Biden and then President Obama and then Vice President Biden was that they didn't believe that. They actually believed that not that everybody wins, that like everything's kumbaya, but that you could make people's lives better by expanding the pie, by being creative with ideas and services, and not at anybody else's real expense, right? Or not at a profound expense. And, I think I know they are still both motivated by that idea. And that's, I think, at the core of the optimism that was so attractive about that, having covered White Houses as of both parties as a journalist, but attractive about those 8 years. And it was the optimism and the faith that we could do better as a country, and we could do better in our jobs. When things were rough in those years, the president would say sometimes to us, to buck us up, never forget that in your entire lives, you will probably not have this much opportunity to do this much good for this many people again. So don't waste it, focus on that. And that's a reason to get up in the morning, right? It's pretty powerful. And, I would say that I know that both, obviously, business is super competitive, and there are winners and there are losers. But in the case of Jeff and Amazon and Brian and Airbnb, it was also like trying to create things that weren't there, that expanded the benefits for consumers, that expanded opportunity for small sellers, or in the case of Airbnb, for homeowners, property owners, to leverage their biggest asset to create and generate some income. And in the Airbnb space, what's, I think, particularly unique about it, it's a tech company, but it lives in the real world, right? It brings people together every day, millions of people every night, hosts and guests, and it really does benefit both sides. And it's kind of, it's very optimistic, and some might say naive, but it's something you have to believe in, which is by doing that, you break down barriers a little bit. You introduce people who don't know each other to each other, and you create a little more cohesion in our community. And I think that's an abiding faith in the sort of Airbnb mission that I find motivating, a reason to get up in the morning, if you will. It's hard to beat working in the Obama White House and knowing that like what you're doing matters every day to so many people, but I feel that way too with what I'm doing now.
Now, kind of switching gears on you, because you were born in Washington. You've spent a lot of time in Washington, and but your first job was in Miami, right?
Yeah.
As the bureau chief, and since then, as a correspondent, as a journalist, you've traveled the world and brought that perspective to not only your job but to Washington. How has the world changed from your perspective? I mean, do you think we have the same shared values as we once did when you started out as a bureau chief in Miami?
Unfortunately, I think the answer to that last question is that there's more polarization, there's more antagonism than certainly I remember when I started. Now, I was younger and maybe more naive, but when I started as a journalist, first in Miami and then based in Moscow in what was then the Soviet Union, but became Russia while I was there, the Soviet Union collapsed. There was this moment in history that was incredibly optimistic, right? This decades-long stasis in our global politics, the Cold War, was falling apart, right? And the good guys won. That was the way it felt, and there was going to be a relatively soft landing for the countries that had been part of the Soviet Union and part of the Soviet orbit as they were integrated into sort of the Western democratic models. A lot of that did happen. I mean, there's a lot of great things that happened out of that. But obviously, Russia turned in a different direction. When I was there, at first, Mikhail Gorbachev was the leader of the Soviet Union. Then it was Boris Yeltsin, the head of Russia. And then I actually met a guy who was an advisor to the democratically elected mayor of St. Petersburg, then Leningrad, became St. Petersburg. And he was the mayor himself was a pro-Western, pro-democracy good guy. His advisor was a former KGB colonel named Vladimir Putin. And Putin ended up, and that was in the early 90s, but Putin ended up rising in stature when Yeltsin was still in power, and then was basically anointed his successor. And honestly, given his background, both connection to Yeltsin, but more importantly to this Anatoly Sobchak, who was the mayor of St. Petersburg, my initial reaction was not really knowing him, and notwithstanding his background in the KGB, thought he must be okay. He must believe in democracy. Couldn't have been more wrong, right? So, what's happened in that period has obviously been extremely upsetting and sad for both. I think the Russian people, certainly terrible for some of the nations around Russia, and most especially Ukraine in the last couple of years. And it's destabilized the world. We thought that a unipolar world where, sort of the United States was on top and the West was on top would be more stable. But the fact that it's not bipolar anymore, where there's sort of two power centers, has created destabilization. And now you have sort of a nexus of kind of bad actors in Russia, Iran, North Korea, and American power and Western power hasn't found it, the most effective way to deal with that. So I think it creates a lot of anxiety. That's the global picture. The domestic picture is obviously even more fractious than in many ways than in terms of the distance that's been traveled from what it was when I started out. I remember coming into Washington from Moscow as a journalist, and Bill Clinton had just been elected president. It was the first year, and I think in 94 and early 95, Newt Gingrich was the new speaker, and he was kind of combative and kind of a flamethrower and provocative. People now trace sort of the kind of politics we have now to Gingrich and the way he operated and the way he, sort of personality assaults and things like that, which I think is true, but it seems like beanbag compared to what we have now, right? Like the kind of every year we would say since I got to DC in 93, boy, politics has gotten more polarized. Politics has gotten more toxic. It's harder and harder to get things done. People used to get along whether they were Democrats or Republicans. It's less and less possible. That has been true every step of the way, but it hasn't abated. It's just gotten more and more intense. And, I think it's a shame because for the sake of the country, for the things that we could be doing, and for the sake of the world, even probably more importantly, a divided United States is not a good thing.
I mean, I could have this conversation with you for days, let alone for this time. Just fascinated by the evolution of where we are, and I think, I fundamentally believe that business is really the greatest platform for change, and so I think that's where my efforts come together. I spent a lot of time in Washington. I love it dearly. But I think we have so much opportunity to deliver our value set through business, through community, through the intersection of all the things we're chatting about, right? And saying, how do we bring people together? So Jess, I think I'm going to pass it back to you.
So Jay, I want to shift gears a little bit more. I'm a big Airbnb fan. I think a little bit of it is that I also went to art school, and so seeing Brian's huge success, I went to art school and then ended up in investment banking at Citi, and then running investment funds and businesses since. But that kind of when he talks about the competitive advantage of being a designer and coming at things with not having his fundamental perspective be an Excel spreadsheet and the ways he feels like that's been an advantage to him. I personally, I find that really inspirational. A couple of things I want to talk about is one, I just want to say how great it is that you guys are helping after the hurricane in Florida here this week. And that's great work that you guys are doing at Airbnb.org.
Well, thank you for mentioning that. It's been obviously just horrific to see what's happened with the 1-2 punch of Hurricane Helene and then Hurricane Milton. The Airbnb.org exists to provide lodging, to provide shelter for people who need it in an emergency situation. And so this is the sweet spot for for why the organization exists. And it's, we've been able to I think I was just meeting with, I oversee Airbnb.org. It's a separate 501c3, it's a foundation, but I'm the executive sponsor at the company for the .org. And obviously there's a lot of important connective tissue. I mean, their mission is around lodging because we're Airbnb, right? So, so far we've just in response to mostly Helene now, but these numbers will go up. Roughly 3,000 people have been giving housing assistance by Airbnb. And that, basically giving them vouchers and the ability to book for free. And then among those are 1,100 kids, more than 1,000 kids, and 661 pets in addition to the humans. And I think, we've discovered that this allows us to, sort of leverage our best asset for good. And it really, I think what's interesting working at Airbnb is how many people at the company want to help. Like .org, or they'll be like, when there's a job opening at .org, they'll be like, I kind of want to go there because it's, it's meaningful. And I think that works when we're actually effective. And I've been very happy with how effective we've been in response to these hurricanes. We do the big ones, we do the small ones, Brazil flooding, earthquake in Japan, the Maui fires, we're there trying to help in every way we can. And it's very gratifying to see.
Yeah, no kidding. So I'm one of the people that actually watches the Airbnb releases like every 6 months or whatever
Brian,
it is.
Thank you for that.
No, I think out of personal,
he cares deeply about it. You can see, he's really good at it, but when he gives that keynote, like it's, you see what we were talking about earlier, that energy, that founder's sort of focus and intensity and love for what he's doing. And it's contagious.
Yeah, it shows. But I think what my favorite thing about them is the evidence of the critical thinking. Like, it's just so obvious that he and you guys on the senior team, it's not just like, okay, how can we get 2% better at this one thing? Like, it's evident that you guys are like fundamentally questioning what's the bottleneck, what's the best part of Airbnb, how can we double down on that, where are the friction, what can we do about that? And it's like, I think there's such short-termism in public companies under this incredible pressure to hit their quarterly numbers that I don't hear that from as many other organizations where they're genuinely, quietly sitting back, fundamentally rethinking the entire experience of their organization, and then doing that like a couple times a year,
And it's a combination of kind of like improving, like always trying to make it better, which is like the core experience. Because remember, this started with, a couple of guys renting out a blow-up bed in their apartment, and it was kind of seat of the pants for a long time after that. And so as amazing as Airbnb was 5, 6, 7 years ago or 2 years ago, there were flaws and glitches that needed fixing, improvements that could be made. And there's a constant focus on that, on the team. And then the parallel track is sort of emphasis on reimagining everything. What happened? Maybe this is, let's just start again. Let's think again about how the app should work, what the guest experience should be like, who should be, wants to be a host. One of the things we're announcing next week is this co-host network, because we found, we have over 8 million listings globally and I think over 5 million hosts. But if you don't do it or don't know somebody who does it, hosting can seem daunting, right? Like, maybe I get it. Like, I have an extra home, or I'm not at my home all the time, or I have extra space in my home. It just seems like too much work. And so we've created a network that allows hosts, either existing hosts who want to expand the number of nights they're offering, or potentially new hosts who are like want a easy path into hosting. This co-host network of sort of tried and true, highly rated hosts who are able to provide services to another host to help them run and manage their property. So they're constantly, I'm on the I'm humble about my responsibilities at a company like this, just like at Amazon. Like I'm not a tech, I'm not even a designer, but I try to think creatively. But I'm certainly not. I don't write code or anything. But I get to talk about it and think about the stories around it, and they make it easy because that's where they start too, right? They start with the people and the stories, like what the meaning is behind what they're creating. Which I find really inspiring, and it starts at the top with Brian.
I'll tell you, like from a personal perspective, that was actually really interesting for me to read about, because at my commercial real estate fund, we had been looking at maybe making a bigger play into short-term rental, and when we were looking at stuff south of the Grand Canyon and out on Puget Sound, across from Seattle and Tacoma and some other areas, and it's like, well, we kind of want to just like test it out. We kind of want to just like run some pilots and see, like, is this the region we want to double down in and eventually have some scale? And it's like, where are we going to find all these staff? And we start interviewing these cleaners and the this and the that. And it's just like, there's so many things you don't realize you got to find, whether you have a whole portfolio or whether you have a single unit.
Right.
And
it just depends on how much can you put into it. And a lot of people are looking for, whether it's from an investment, perspective, like you're talking about, or should I try something and scale it? Or if you're just you've got one property you're thinking about offering, but like maybe you've got a full-time job, maybe you've got, it's like, you can't be obviously in town all the time. So, and the best sort of host service is the kind that can be there in quickly on site if there's a problem. So I think that our goal is, sort of, you would think this far in, we would know this already, and we did know it, but that this was a friction point. But now we figured out a way to address it, and we really hope it makes a difference. We think we're confident that it will result in in growth among hosts and listings, and then overall quality of the experience for guests. Because when you're a host and you've got a co-host who knows what he or she is doing, it really makes a difference for the guest.
Yeah, I think we toyed around with the idea of my kids are big surfers like me, and
my son we love snowboarding. My kids are too. I can't surf for the life of me.
So we love living up on the mountain. We're out by Park City on the other side of the valley, up on the side of the mountain. It's great. Snowboarding out to the backcountry and all the stuff, but we miss the surfing, right? We used to live in Southern California. And the idea of like, I don't know, can we go to Costa Rica for a summer, right? Like a good chunk of
as a family.
time. And the idea of like, oh, could we have somebody co-host our own house back home while we went on like an extended
Exactly.
trip?
First time I ever heard about Airbnb was in DC. I mean, not heard about it. First time I ever knew like somebody who was hosting, our neighbors across the street in DC proper. And he was a captain in the DC police force, and they had a bunch of kids, and they were going away, and they, were telling us, by the way, we're going away for a few weeks. We decided to be Airbnb hosts. We're going to have this family stay with us. And we're like, wow, that's so interesting. Maybe we should try that. And then, we got to meet the family. Like we're here if you need us to be helpful. And you sort of get the idea that it's a very human, sort of process. It's not like ordering a product, right, and getting it in the mail, right? It's like the human touch matters a lot, and both in how the listing, the home feels and looks, and then the kind of service around it that a host can provide, and just answering questions and decomplexifying things, especially for new users who aren't really sure what to expect. So we're optimistic about it.
Yeah. Well, you should be. Anything else you want to talk about this winter release here?
Well, we have a lot of, sure. We have a lot of.
I mean, there's a long list.
There's
like a whole bunch of things.
I would just say that we have, in keeping with what I mentioned earlier, that like constant improvement of what we're offering. There's, I think, more than 50 upgrades on the guest side that make the search experience easier, that it's more personalized, more intuitive. Like there's a lot of information that we can glean from your past searches or listings if you're a frequent user, to sort of make recommendations. So, I mean, otherwise it can be like the site's beautiful on, the app, like it's gorgeous, right? But if you're thinking about 8 million listings and basically every country in the world, it can be like, well, where do I start? What am I looking for? And people often start with the location they want to go, but sometimes they're not really sure. So we can kind of, what we're doing with these upgrades is making that sort of experience more intuitive and faster and quicker with, plate location recommendations. We know, for example, that you travel, often travel with your family for longer stays, right? So you want a full home. You don't want to spread out your family in a bunch of hotel rooms, which is why you've come to Airbnb to begin with. But also, we know what you like. Maybe if a family has young kids, we know that it's got to be, family friendly. So we can push those listings up to the top, recommend you look at those, based on past reviews and things like that. So that's, hopefully that'll make the experience on the guest side, that much more delightful and useful. So always improving, and that work is never done. It will never be perfect. So we're going to keep at it. But part of what we've done over the last 3 years, really, since right before I started, was focus on these improvements to sort of get as close to perfecting the core offering as we can, because we think that creates permission to expand beyond the core. So, we're really looking to, as we make these improvements and we make it better and better, what new cool thing can we do where we've won the permission of and the sort of the grace of our guests to say, well, they're really good at this, maybe they're good at that too, and they'll try it.
It's exciting. I feel like there's also this thing that Airbnbs almost make you want to go do something more fun instead of a box that has a bathroom. The Airbnb, it's you guys have been able to project an image and influence society of the oh, well, this would be cool. Let's go get a cool Airbnb at some cool place. Instead of just for my family, half the time we're price hunting. We're okay, what's the best hotel at the cheapest price?
Right.
And that is the extent of the equation.
Right. And you kind of know what you're going to get. And if you're at the higher end, you're counting on it being nice, but it is even the nicest places can feel kind of cookie cutter, and they don't, what I think about when I think about that state of mind or perspective that you just talked about, it's sort of think about, okay, I'm going to Paris. There's some great hotels in Paris, of course, but Paris is a romantic place, and it's all about location. And you think about the romance of living in Paris. Well, I can't live there, but I'm going for a week. Wouldn't I rather be in an apartment? I was we were a sponsor of the Olympics, so I got to bring my family, and we were in this amazing apartment in a part of Paris that has very few hotels. So it's not touristy. It's we felt like we were living there, and we were there for 10 days. It was amazing. And kitchen and all the amenities that a home has. So you're not having to always go out just because you want a cup of coffee or a croissant, although that's always worthwhile in Paris. So, I think that, to me, we obviously see a lot of our business in group travel because we do it is a differentiated offering, right? Yeah, we see a lot of solo travelers. I do it, and there's it's you get more space, it's just more homey and comfortable. But if you're traveling with your family or with a group, I just think it's a no-brainer, honestly. And as long as we're offering homes that you want to stay in, and that's our job to make sure that we're doing that.
Yeah, no kidding. How long were you with Time before you went to the White House?
I'm going to date myself. I was at Time magazine for 20 years and a week. So I think it was, And I went to work out of college, right, for the Miami Herald, which was the best place that would take somebody right out of college. But I had done an internship at Time magazine when I was still in college. And I'll tell this funny story. It was the intern lunch, the summer there were 8 of us in New York in the summer of 1986. And I sat down next to a guy at this lunch, it was a buffet, who I thought was another intern. Turns out he was the editor of the Nation section. His name was Walter Isaacson. So Walter became a lifelong mentor of mine, said, oh, you should come work for me for this summer. And I did in his section. I got to write stories as a college student in Time magazine. But he also told me, we don't hire people out of college. We're Time magazine. You got to go work for a newspaper, because he had worked for a newspaper. So I did. But of course, the whole time I was there, I was sent, hire me because I really wanted to go to at the time I'd studied Russian in college. Soviet Union was incredibly exciting. Gorbachev was in power, perestroika, glasnost, and I was like, I gotta go. Time hired me. They kept me in Miami for a while because they needed me there, but sent me pretty soon to Moscow, and it was an incredible experience. And I'm still in touch with Walter to this day because he was a great taught me a lot about writing and storytelling and just appreciating what being.
Oh, he's so famous for his books these days.
Yeah,
right?
no, he's had a hell of a career, that's for sure.
Yeah. So after 20 years at Time, I think it's kind of nice that you can prove like your past doesn't have to be a rut. Like it can be helpful, and we can always reinvent ourselves.
I think I tell people this all the time, Jess, that it's like, and I think I mentioned earlier, it was kind of serendipitous. I wasn't, a journalist thinking, oh, I want to go into government. I was inspired by President, then candidate Obama and that campaign. But I was the Washington bureau chief for Time magazine. I was running our political coverage, and in fact, in a real piece of luck, I was not writing about Obama, because had I been writing about him, I'm sure I would have written something that would have made it impossible for him to hire me years later. So I wrote almost nothing. I covered mostly the other side, and I had been pretty close, and covered for a long time with John McCain. So, but a close friend is Tony Blinken, who's now the Secretary of State, but he was the guy who was working for Biden. Biden gets picked as the running mate. They're going in, and he had this idea, he suggested, oh, maybe you want to come in. And he couldn't hire me, but then I met with Senator Biden, Vice President-elect Biden, and it all sort of started. And suddenly I was leaving this career in journalism that it just felt like and I'm so glad I did, because I could have failed miserably, because you think you cover politics and you cover White Houses. Oh, well, then I know how to do that. You go in, it's totally different. Like, it's completely different. First of all, White House correspondents, even the good ones, only know about 10% of what's actually happening. Not because it's being hidden, but there's so much happening and it's so complex. They also don't understand like the humanity of it, that it's often things that seem calculated or deliberate, or just, they unfold that way, they're accidental. And that, people make decisions for the right reasons, or at least they think the right reasons. Anyway, so I stumbled into that and that job, and then suddenly I didn't think that was, I thought I'd do that for a few years. Working for Biden was great. I worked with Ron Klain, the chief of staff to Vice President Biden at the time, who went on to be President Biden's chief of staff the first 2 years, and is now the general counsel at Airbnb. So full circle, right? So,
yeah.
Just and that's why when I was leaving government, I was like, I am not just gonna do what is expected, right? Which is sort of trade off of who I used to be. Former this says this, and it's like, at some point, if you don't even care what you're saying, why should anybody else? And then I just wanted to leverage the fact that I had a decent amount of credibility when I left, and also my boss had enormous credibility, to try to do something different and test myself. And honestly, when Jeff hired me in Amazon, I don't think a leap of faith by them. I was going to be reporting directly to him in a function that hadn't existed, and to run all of public policy and comms, and it was so exciting. And I was drowning at first because I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I didn't even understand what they were saying in the meetings, right? The jargon and I hadn't been in this world, and but I brought something to it, obviously, and it was just fun. It was I think I want to learn until I die, right? Because otherwise, it just, things get old and boring.
Yeah. Well, I would love to talk about President Obama, Jeff Bezos, and Brian Chesky. Okay, let's start with why don't you give me one principle that you think, for President Obama, here's a principle that I would attribute a lot of his success to. Here's one for Jeff. Here's one for Brian.
I think for President Obama, principle. It sounds corny, but I think he's one of the most high integrity people I've ever met. It's just it's like, do what you fundamentally believe is the right thing, and the politics will work themselves out. And again, that sounds like something a press secretary would say on the podium, but I know him personally. I'm still, and it's like, that is his sort of foundational belief. And I think with Jeff, it was, that this is where I learned something that I understand is like embedded in Silicon philosophy, but it's sort of like like you cannot create something new if you don't fail to create something new many times, right? That like I was at Amazon for 7.5 years, and obviously they were already a big company when I started in 2015. But we were like creating things like business lines, ideas, products that were being piloted. Like I would lose track, and most of them didn't work out. Right? People think of Amazon as this, everything they do, succeeds. They make a bunch of money. They're uh, dominating and things like that. But most of what, a lot of what they tried, there were the famous ones like the Fire Phone. They crashed and burned, but it didn't work out. A couple $1 billion invested. But there were many other things that we tried while I was there that just didn't pan out, and that was okay, right? That because it was this understanding that if you had a solid plan, and it wasn't like any idea got a green light. It was that you had to have a rational plan around it, and obviously that would be talked through. But then it was like, okay, here's the funding, go do it. Let's see. And most of it didn't work, and but some of it did spectacularly. So, and I think for Brian, it's about like nothing works well unless it's designed well, right? He believes. My understanding of what design means has changed dramatically just in the few years I've known Brian, because you design a human resources organization. We don't call it that at Airbnb anymore. Like you have to design it purposely. You have to be purposeful about what you're doing, no matter how small you think it is. And it can be, people think of design and they think of visual things that are beautiful or magical, and we do that for sure. But a lot of it is sort of designing it so it functions correctly and it works and it flows and it's seamless, and that's what he's obsessed about. He's often saying that when he sees something that's not where it needs to be, in his view, it's because there's a failure in design somewhere, or a missed opportunity in design, and I find that fascinating.
Yeah, no kidding. Let's go through the same list again. From having spent time with them quietly behind closed doors, what's something people may not necessarily recognize or not expect? Again, President Obama.
I don't know what, it's sort of funny because certainly when I worked for him when he was running for president, when he was president, he had this reputation for being aloof, sort of keeps to himself. He wasn't a classic backslapping politician and stuff. And my experience was so different because, when you're president of the United States, you obviously get some great spaces like the residence and the big Oval Office and your private dining room. And on Air Force One, there's this fabulous bedroom in the nose of the plane with its own shower. There's a giant office that's all yours. We couldn't get President Obama to go to those spaces because he always wanted to hang out in the conference room. And we would often, there were 4 of us, and we would play cards while he was reading his briefing books or making calls, whatever. And we would just, for hours and hours on, he always wanted to be around people. And I always thought it was so interesting that because he was so temperamentally cool, and not like, he didn't fly off the handle, which was a joy, as in your boss, and rational, that there was this idea that he was sort of a loner, and I couldn't have been more the opposite. In fact, and we would travel, and often he'd do an event, and then he couldn't leave the hotel afterwards for security reasons, and staff and journalists would go out for dinner, and he'd be like, I don't, what am I going to do? So he would call some of us in. We'd play more cards, and because he wanted to, he liked the camaraderie, the conversation, and especially we kind of, we'd try to keep it light and talk a lot of sports, a lot of golf, which I find boring, but the basketball I loved, and other things. So I think that's the one thing about him. I think Jeff. When I was working with him, I always loved getting him in front of an audience or in a meeting, because he had become so famous, and really it exploded on my watch, where when he was dubbed the richest person in the world at one point, and it was just like, he went from being somebody with whom you could walk down the street in most places and he wouldn't be recognized necessarily, even though he had once been, Time Magazine Person of the Year and that kind of stuff, to being to being this entity. And so people had these expectations about it, and of course their views of Amazon and what kind of a business it was affected it. And he always surprised everybody on the upside because he was, he, like, if you've ever heard his laugh, like, he loves to laugh. He loves to have, I went out for dinner when I was still being courted with him and his then wife and my wife, and in Seattle, and we spent 2.5 hours and never talked about Amazon. And I had already had meetings and met with him, that kind of stuff. But I said, I'm in, because it was this fascinating conversation about so many different subjects. And I remember when he stood up, he's like, well, any questions about Amazon? I said, I'm good, because I just felt like I like being around him. I'm going to learn from him. He's super interesting. And then Brian, I think, he's still very much who he was. Like, he's this young, brilliant, successful tech founder. But I think that, what people forget, even though you're so successful and wealthy, and is that like, he has Airbnb, and he has his dog Sophie, and like, he's just focused, like, he lives pretty modestly. Like, he's in it because he loves the creativity of it, and it's not about accumulating accolades or material things, right? And I find that pretty special too, and pretty unusual.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, this has been so fun. If people want to follow you, are LinkedIn and Twitter the best places, or what's good?
LinkedIn and Twitter, at Jay Carney, and then on Twitter, and then I don't tweet as much as I used to, but because of what it's happened, especially when I was doing it in politics, it became such a unnerving experience. But I do, obviously, now on behalf of Airbnb and on some other issues too. So and then LinkedIn, obviously, is a good place to go. Every once in a while I'll post on Instagram.
Yeah. What do you want to leave people with today?
I think just that I'll just go back to, obviously, what I do now, and that is that for folks who haven't, on both sides of our platform, so to speak, hosting and guesting side, like, even though Airbnb has been around for a while now, and it's a noun and a verb, and people have a sense of what it is, obviously a ton of people haven't tried it, and even more people haven't hosted. And my message is that, we're doing things to make the hurdle much lower. Like, if you want to host, so try it. We have hosts, like a huge percentage of our hosts tell us that they do it to make ends meet. And it allows them to stay in their home. When we engage in cities, and we have this unique proposition, which is, like, when people stay with us, unlike a giant hotel corporation, the money stays. The money that the guest pays, like, overwhelmingly stays in the community and stays with your constituent, I say to a politician, who's trying to pay her mortgage, right? So, and then on the guest side, it's just, I'm not disparaging hotels, having stayed in many in my life, and they can be a useful and great experience, but it is really magical and different. If you want to go somewhere and actually experience it more like a local, you have that opportunity. Your success in achieving that goal is gonna, be much higher if you stay in an Airbnb, because you're not going to be in the tourist center, the equivalent of Midtown Manhattan, wherever you're going, and you're going to have this distinct experience, because no home is exactly like another home, right? They're always different, and they're always. And we've tried to make it much easier to make sure, if you're nervous about reliability, we have a thing called guest favorites, which is like, if you're new, I still do this when I book. Like, I just filter for guest favorites, because that is, as close to an ironclad guarantee as we can give you that this is, like, guests have loved this, the hosts are fantastic, it's highly reliable. Start there, and you won't be disappointed.
No kidding. Well, I think that's a mic drop. That's so great. Thanks for doing this.
Well, I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much, Jess. Appreciate it.
You bet. Bye, everyone.